It's important to stop, consciously consider what are your core values? How are you going to use them to guide the decisions that you make day to day and when you're looking at long-term planning? And once you've identified what's really important to you, then it's easier to actually integrate them into your everyday life. So for this particular exercise, you identify 5 of your core values and what they are to you. They have a whole different list of things that it could be that go from being very broad to very narrow. So for example, you might say relationships, which is pretty broad, or you might specify family as a particular one because you really want to narrow it in and you want to focus on that. It really depends from person to person. And then it's really looking at how do you actually actualize that in your daily life, right? So if you say, for example, family is important to you and you look at your roles. So like, for example, yes, I'm a mom. Yes, I'm a wife. Yes, I'm a daughter and I'm a daughter-in-law. And you look at your family.
Hey, let's welcome my guest, Crystal Jones, who is a PhD and a U.S. Army leader and an industrial organizational psychologist who also serves as a certified retained parental leave coach and emotional intelligence trainer. Good to see you and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. I'll let you start with your story, however you want to put it, where you come from, and just to better understand your background before we move on to other questions.
Okay, so I was raised initially in California, moved to Washington, to Centralia, Washington. I later graduated from high school, went to the University of Montana, Billings for 1 semester, and I went home on vacation from college and I decided to join the United States Army. At the time, my cousin was looking into it and I went to the recruiter with him and I just kind of was thinking about it. And I was like, you know what? I see a lot of people graduating from college and they're not making a lot of money because they have 0 experience. And then I'm seeing individuals working for them with way more experience, making less money because they don't have a college degree. So at that time, I was just going to go into the Army for 4 years and then get out, go to law school was my plan at the time. So I enlisted as an active duty paralegal specialist and decided to leave active duty, focus on my first daughter who was born in 2000. I enlisted back onto active duty in 2001. I decided to leave active duty to focus on my second daughter, who was born in 2003. Shortly thereafter, I transitioned from the inactive Ready Reserve to a TPU, the United States Army Reserve, because I just missed being in the Army. I was just at the time, I didn't want to do it full time. I did that for about a year and I entered into what we call a simultaneous membership program with ROTC. So while going to college, I was a cadet in the reserves, working several jobs just to be able to pay for everything. I commissioned on active duty in 2006 as a human resources officer. I had our third daughter in 2011. I experienced severe postpartum depression, almost leading me to leave active duty. However, I continued to serve, and I will tell you, I refer to that experience as one of my best and worst experiences of my life. It really was the catalyst and driving force that changed the way that I looked at life itself, and is what really kept me pursuing my PhD until I achieved in industrial organizational psychology. I served in a series of key developmental positions as well as high visibility positions throughout my entire doctoral journey, to include serving in the Pentagon, most recently serving as the Kansas City Army Recruiting Battalion Commander. So that's just a little bit of background on myself related to talking about working motherhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of that, you mentioned that you want to talk about values, priorities, and boundaries. We can start on that. You can lead it here. What's your experience? What you want to share with the public? Please, go ahead.
Okay. So really, values is something that very early on is instilled into you and talked about in the United States Army. But I will tell you my experience, particularly any of the key developmental assignments that I've been in, whether it's on staff or command, as well as the different times that I've experienced motherhood, going from the first time being a working mother to then, being a mother at home during my leave time and then coming back on to work. When I look at from that experience, particularly for my third daughter, which is the one that I mentioned, the postpartum depression, it made me take a hard look at my values. And it was one of the reasons I pursued something that is known as retained parental leave coaching. And in that, one of the things that you do is you There's a key exercise that's utilized in pretty much any time when someone's going to have an initial session with that. And really, it's important to stop, consciously consider, what are your core values? How are you going to use them to guide the decisions that you make day to day and when you're looking at long-term planning? And once you've identified what's really important to you, then it's easier to actually integrate them into your everyday life. So for this particular exercise, you identify 5 of your core values and what they are to you. They have a whole different list of things that it could be that go from being very broad to very narrow. So for example, you might say relationships, which is pretty broad, or you might specify family as this particular one because you really want to narrow it in and you want to focus on that. It really depends from person to person. And then it's really looking at how do you actually actualize that in your daily life, right? So if you say, for example, family is important to you and you look at your roles. So like, for example, yes, I'm a mom. Yes, I'm a wife. Yes, I'm a daughter and I'm a daughter-in-law. And you look at your family roles that are the most important to you. And you think about, for example, if maybe it really means a lot to your family because when you prepare, so you're very intentional that 3 days a week that you will prepare dinner for the family. Or if you say, hey, my faith is important to me, well, what does that mean when you actually make that actualize into your life? Okay, so I'm going to go to church on Sundays. And each morning I'm going to do, 15 minutes in the morning for prayer and 15 minutes at the end of the day in prayer. And you can apply that to any of the different values that you find are most important to you. I think what's really important in that is knowing there is no wrong answer other than not being honest with yourself. And I say that because a lot of times people will think about things that are important to them, but they'll become dismissive of them, kind of like a shadow value because it's something that maybe in their organization or in their family or in their friend group that isn't necessarily seen the same way. The other thing that I would just say with that is just looking at priorities. So, one approach to that when you're thinking of priorities in your life is having some sort of framework for it. So, for example, with myself, I have 4 different priorities, which are relationships, which in that, includes, like I mentioned before, the different roles that I have to include, if I have specific friends that I want to make sure that I do things with, whether it's in a quarter or whether it's monthly. So it might be, friend to Kristen, for example. And then professional, really looking at things that are tangible. So I may have one large project that's for my workplace. I may have one personal professional item. So maybe it's writing a scholarly article, or maybe it's doing a podcast. And then like self-development. So having it there. And I just always recommend is no more than 3 things for each of your areas. So another one for me is having fun. I think it's absolutely critical that that's something that's not missed and that we're very intentional with. Because unfortunately, it's kind of like date night. It's the thing that people can easily take off of the calendar and they think no one will notice it. But guess what? You will notice it because it's going to change how it affects how you perceive your own life, how you're experiencing your life, and then those that you spend your time with. And then the other one, and I don't say the last one because I don't consider it last, but is wellness, which is something that often people don't necessarily prioritize. They have well meaning to, but really kind of niching it down to what are the goals in those areas. And so a way, an activity to do that is with something like an action board. So instead of a vision board where you have things that are like pictures and stuff that you look at that reminds you of it, it would be more of things that are tangible. So it might be, for example, if you were to say, wellness and I'm wanting to get a particular score on my Army fitness test as an example, and then thinking through what does that mean to have that. The other thing I think that is helpful when doing something like that is just writing out a list of what you want more of in life. What are the things you want to remove from your life and what are the things you want to add to your life? And then the other thing I think is just writing out a list of important roles. So if it's mom, if it's dad, if it's son, if it's daughter, if it's, friend to Kristen, friend to Seth. And the reason I think those are important as part of that thought process. And I don't say a planning process because it really is about self-reflection. And that really is what leads to self-leadership and being able to have the life that you want. I think when looking at priorities, another thing that's super important is finding a mentor in each of your priorities. So this is an individual that's going to help you to have more context for the different situations, circumstances, relationships, things that you are going to think through, endure. And with that, I would say is really looking for someone that has both depth and breadth of experience regarding those particular priorities, because self-leadership, it matters, and a mentor will help you to better lead yourself in those priorities, and not just in keeping them, but actualizing what you want to actually see the end state look like. I think a lot of times people will look for one mentor in their life and not really acknowledge the fact that that one person likely isn't a mirror image of what you want for yourself. They're probably a portion of it. There was a quote I heard before that people are made through people, just meaning kind of like we're all a collage of all the different experiences and people that we interact with in our lives. And so I think kind of having that mindset is helpful. The last area is boundaries. And so looking at areas in your life, so individual, important relationships, and work. And I say all three of those because often people will particularly leave out individual. So I know as a leader and as a coach, when I ask people about their personal goals, it is very commonplace immediately. They will start telling me about things related to other people that are important to them in their life. So I have very much both in leadership sessions, sitting down, and coaching sessions, separated out individual from family and friends because those are uniquely different. So, an example of an individual goal might be if I know for me, running helps me to not have as much stress in my life. That is an individual area. And what is it that I need from that area? And what is it I need to protect? So, for example, if it is running for an hour in the morning, 5 days a week, or if it is running for 30 minutes for 3 days a week, what is it that I, Crystal, need? And really spending some time to know that about myself is one thing. And then the other thing is just when looking at the relationships piece there, I think it's super important that those individuals who are the other part of your relationship are part of the discussion. So you can have a good idea of how that plays a role in the actual relationships. So it's not more of a perception on your side or a one-way interaction. It really truly is relational in nature. And then of course, work. I think what I've found is many a times people are very good at either setting personal boundaries or setting professional boundaries. And I think what most people will find is that they will be more satisfied with their life if they set boundaries in each of those three areas. And remember, boundaries are for us as an individual, they are not for other people. And that's why it's really important to figure out what those look like so you can make sure that you're able to apply them, which I'll kind of talk a little bit about them in the last area that kind of ties some of that together of what I call when life happens. So, when life happens being uh, an acronym, imagine that, being in the military, is B2, so B squared, S, R3, so R cubed, be so ready. So the two B's is boundaries, keeping them firm but flexible. I think that's very important in knowing which ones you cannot bend, or they will either A, if it's an individual one, break you, or B, crush a relationship, or really adversely affect you in the workplace. And those ones, being cautious and making sure you communicate to others which ones are firm and which ones are flexible and how they're flexible. Is it that it's in the hours? Like, for example, maybe lunch, right? You could eat lunch, you'd say, hey, sometime between 11 and we'll say 1 or 11 and 2, right? But if you start eating lunch at, somewhere between 4 and 6, that is not lunch. Some people can call it dinner if it were 4 o'clock. And then the other thing is backup plans. So if something's important enough to make it to your calendar, to make it to your schedule, to be a part of what your plan is for a day, then it's important enough to think about if something happened, when life happens, what am I going to do? And think about it in advance. So a lot of people talk about white space. A way that I have been taught, it is a method, definitely not the only method, but is how, for example, meetings and engagements, planning them for a little bit longer of time than they're typically going to take. And what that does is it preserves that space on your calendar. So when people see it. It's not this open space for them just to fill in for you. It is something that you can utilize to be able to complete other things that are must-do items, and usually trying to look for something like between 1 to 2 things. And then the S being shift, so know in advance what other times or days could work for something that you have on your calendar, on your schedule, in your plan for the day. And then the R's, so reduce. So you can shorten the amount and time for things, and sometimes still either A, you get the minimal amount of what you needed from it, or B, it's enough to fulfill the requirement you're looking for. So, for example, let's say it could have been running, and run typically in the morning, but hey, the backup to that is evening runs instead of a morning run. Was for the shift, and then applying that same concept to shorten the amount of time, maybe typically running an hour, but instead reducing the amount of time to 30 minutes, and then realign. So that is thinking about what are those tasks that you can actually realign together. For example, let's say I did not get my run in the morning. And really, the intent of me spending some time, we'll say I was going to go shopping with one of my daughters, go to the mall. We were just going to walk around, just spend some time together. But if it were my middle daughter, she likes to run too. So I can realign that run time with that other space. So ask her, hey, I didn't get my run in today. Would you like to go running instead of, going and walking around the mall or the outlets? And the last one is remove. So I say proceed with caution, because if something makes it to your calendar, if removing it becomes commonplace, it's probably time to reevaluate if it's something that should be temporarily or permanently removed. And I say that because otherwise it's constantly using space that it doesn't need to be using. So, but it could be something where it's a temporary removal, not a permanent. So really thinking through that. Or is this something that you need to be more proactive with boundaries to safeguard? And so just really being able to think through that and make a decision about it is a way to kind of handle that piece as well. And I would say too, an application to that, I think looking kind of at the different maybe items that you have in your life. So, block items, I call those, survival items. So those are things that, no kidding, you need to do. And there are designated times typically for doing them. So like eating, sleeping, departing for an important event, key family activities, wellness items. Those are things that often you can weave throughout your day, depending on kind of your own structure you have. Some people have those kind of walking treadmills that they are walking on while they're doing their work, or they might have weights in their office where maybe during breaks they're lifting their weights. So there is capabilities to do things like that, making sure we schedule time for rest. And what I already mentioned about that white space there. So you have a place that you can utilize if you really truly need it to do something that's a necessity. Relationship items, those are important block items that you need to make sure happen, because what kind of happens with that is people will think it's not a big deal that they keep missing fill in the blank. Is it date night? Is it soccer practice? Is it studying with your child? Whatever it is that you think that, oh, it's just one more time of missing it, but it accumulates up. And before you know it, you're looking in the mirror and you're just kind of like, man, I don't even know what happened here. But really, there were indicators along the way. And with that, knowing your obligations, and kind of thinking through that process I talked about earlier, making sure that you have fun time that's a part of your life. And then there's this category I just call other stuff. It's the things other people want you to do. It doesn't mean that you don't need to do it. But it does mean being intentional when you're doing it, and making sure it's something that's going to be added value either for you or for them, if it's someone that you care about, even though it may not directly seem to add value for you, but it adds value because it's pouring into your relationship with that person by just being mindful and giving them intentionality with it. And I think tying this back into the concept of, the whole working motherhood, I think it's very easy to have mom guilt. It's easy to have wife guilt. It's easy to have leader guilt. And that's why boundaries are so important, because they will help reduce those unpleasant feelings, because you're communicating it along the way. And it's not something you're waiting to talk about until the very end. And I think the last thing that I would just tie into it is really kind of what I started out with is I was just sharing about my own experience with postpartum depression and really played a huge role in my life in choosing to get my PhD and to finishing my PhD. And, really each of my girls have played a huge role in making sure that I did finish that kind of in different ways. Have you played a role in me as a leader? I always say that my number one leadership role I have is being a mom. And so the title for my actual doctoral study was From Working Woman to Working Mother, quality study on identity transformation and the role of emotional intelligence. And with that, really, I was looking at, from being a working woman as a starting point to being a pregnant working woman, which is a whole identity of its own, to being a mom, who is on leave, figuring out and focusing on the identity as a mom, because you have that. Now what's nice is in a lot of places, you have more time than we used to. Like in the Army, we have 3 months, and that's actually not just for moms, that's for dads too. And then the working mother, which is putting together those different identities together into one. And it's really interesting going through it multiple times because every experience truly is an experience of its own. I'm going to pause there and see if there's just anything that you want to ask me about or think I should add to.
Well, first of all, what an amazing opportunity to learn from you. You know, this is just great. Like the whole framework that you outlined, it's great, and the way you put it all together makes total sense. What I want to add to this or ask you is, this is a very intentional approach to designing your life and relationships and boundaries and the way you live, basically. How hard is it for people to go from a complete chaos when it comes to their life to organizing it in this very intentional way? And have you seen people struggling to develop this strict but at the same time strict in a way where you can give yourself freedom as well, kind of designed to their own life?
So I would say that number one, when looking at each of the things, is breaking it down into smaller tasks. So not necessarily doing everything all at one time. I personally myself, and interestingly, in the study I did, really found there's a real power in pockets of time, which is something that I found a lot of mothers learn when they have their baby is uh, how much you can do in 5 minutes, how much you could do in 15 minutes, whether it's simply like, I'm going to jump in the shower or I'm going to have a quick cup of coffee. And so I think 15 minutes is a good amount of time to set aside. The other thing is there's a book I read. It's Start with the Why. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but I think too is knowing why you're spending time to get to know yourself, because that's the whole values part of it was kind of the first exercise I mentioned, which is a super easy exercise to do. It's helpful if you do it with other people, whether it's a coach or with, a group of friends or a group of coworkers. That's something I would tell you is not just that exercise, but I found that when people do these activities with others, I'll give an example. Working on my dissertation, right? And it took me a long time. I started in 2014. I defended in 2024. So I had to get an extension, right? Like usually you get 8 years and that's all you get. I would say all, but 8 years is a long time, I know. But that said is if I didn't have the meetups on Zoom, like the power hours and stuff, I don't know if I would have finished. So I think even exploring yourself, I think it's good to sit down with a journal, write some things out, but there's a lot of um, structure that's given just by meeting up and talking to other people who are particularly whatever it is about yourself that you think stands out. Like for me, in this case, was being a mom, right? So I think talking to other people who are working moms, or, when I was working on my dissertation, talking to other working moms who are working on their dissertation, others who are going through similar struggles. And then that's kind of when I said the mentor piece is I think identifying someone who is slightly ahead of you it's good if you find someone who's further ahead too, because you can kind of have almost a mile marker of the future you, the you in 2 years, the you now, and then maybe look back and see, can I pay this forward to someone else where maybe if I think about it, I've actually can see my progress where I am by talking to them, and they can learn from me. So I think connecting with other people helps tremendously, is what I've seen. The other thing I think is important is what you said, the whole, having a structure but being flexible. I think that is probably one of the most important things, and knowing the things you can't bend on, right? So, for example, if you don't have someone else that's picking up your child from daycare, you need to make sure you go pick up your child, right? There's certain things like you can't bend on unless you have another plan for it. And it's a no breaker deal. And I think what I found too is people who can spend some time sharing their why with other people that they work with or they work for or in their family, they get a lot more support that way, than they do if they just were to just put out a list of items, because that person, they may hear that list completely different and be like, well, I don't see why, you need to fill in the blank, right? So I think having those discussions is probably, I would say, the second thing that's really important. And the third, I would think, is particularly when removing items, ask yourself why you had it on there in the first place. Because if you are removing something very important to you again and again, it will start staring you in the face, and it will force you to make a decision of being honest with yourself. I can say being fill in the blank is important to me, or I can say this activity is important to me, but if I continuously take it off my calendar, it is not. So those are some things I think is being some honesty checks with yourself, connecting with other people, and then communicating with other people.
Awesome. Well, a lot of emotional intelligence topics, which is something I'm passionate about. Very, very glad to be learning from you. And before we wrap up the episode, we have 1 or 2 minutes left. Do you have a final word for the listeners? Something that you want to emphasize on, or maybe something that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet? Please go ahead and use this time to do that.
I think just as a lasting thought is, we spend a lot of time with a lot of people in our lives, but the person we spend the most time with is ourselves. Interestingly, the person that we often know the least about is ourselves. We spend a lot of time studying other people, trying to figure out how to lead other people, trying to figure out how to have good relationships with other people. Don't forget you have a relationship with yourself. And don't forget how important it is to invest time in relationships to include with yourself. So I would encourage people to spend time to figure out what are their values, what are their priorities, and what are the boundaries that are going to help them to be respectful of those.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining the podcast today, and for sharing this whole framework and your thoughts and experiences. Super great episode. And yeah, thank you again.
Thanks for having me and for reaching out. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.